Hello everyone, Christina Werner here. Welcome to day 14 of the holiday card series for 2023. Today I'm going to be making this really fun ornament card, and I'm using some dies and stamps from Concord and Ninth. I'm using the ornament stamp and stitch dies. Now there are some little stitching holes that you can cut out using the die cuts or the dies, but I chose not to do any stitching on my ornament today. Instead, I'm going to be stamping and doing some fun kind of coloring with the stamps. So I have this one decorative element that is sized perfectly for the dies, and I'm starting with the color Pink Lemonade from Concord and Ninth. And I'm going to stamp this decorative image multiple times just to get a really good impression with the ink. This was a brand new stamp set, so all of the stamps were nice and slick. Sometimes it's best to kind of condition your stamps, maybe by running your fingers over them or something like that. It just helps the stamps take the ink a little bit better. Now, I was not remembering this fact and ended up having to stamp it 3 times. Not a huge deal since I'm using my Misty though. I'm now moving on to the color Poppy, also from Concord and Ninth. I'm applying it to about the bottom half of this image, and then I'm taking a red blending brush, or rather a blending brush that I've designated for all my red inks, and I'm softening the edge of that applied ink on the surface of my stamp. This is going to give it a little bit of a blurred edge and help it sort of blend in to that pink color that's already been stamped. I wanted a little more of that red, so I did repeat this one more time. And I also brought the red up a little bit higher and didn't take quite as much ink off with the brush. This is also going to help it kind of blend. By stamping it a few times, it helps it transition from color to color. The last color I'm using is Cranberry, and I mostly just want this on the bottom third of this shape. So I just applied it to the bottom, and then used a blending brush just to take off a little bit off the top edge of that ink to soften it. Did it a few times, and then I stamped down. Now, when you're doing this multicolor stamping technique, you do want to make sure that your paper is always in the same spot. So in between each one of these stampings, I did kind of pick up the paper and nestle it back into the corner of my Misty. The magnet, while doing a great job, doesn't always hold it perfectly, so it's best just to double check that. I went back and stamped one more layer of the middle shade because I wanted a little more of that bright red transitioning into the pink. It looks almost like the shape is split in half at the moment, so by stamping it just one more time, it's going to help transition from that middle area up to the top. The stamp set actually has interior pieces for this design. So I positioned it directly over those flower shapes. And this time I remembered to rub my fingers over the stamp. And then I used that same pink color. This is the Pink Lemonade. And I did end up stamping that a few times just so it would match that pink that's already there a little bit more. And so I'd have more even coverage. These inks do tend to smooth out as they dry, so most of the time if there's any splotchiness, I'll just let that go. But I went ahead and stamped it 3 times just so I'd have really good coverage. All right, I'm not going to stamp the dots, although those dots are in the stamp set. Instead, I plan to cover those in gold kind of pearls. So I used the ornament die and cut that out. And then I picked out some other colors of cardstock, avocado and artichoke and cranberry, all from Concord and Ninth, and then some gold matte cardstock. I used the 2 leaf dies in the die set, the ornament topper as well as the berries. And then I started to assemble everything on top of my ornament. And I realized if I was going to have the leaves kind of hanging down over those where those white dots are, I needed to have them covered with the gold pearls before I adhered the leaves. And luckily, this set of gold embellishments from Craft Consortium were almost the exact perfect size to cover up these white dots. I think it's such a fun way to bring in a little bit of shine. For the leaves, I put a little bit of glue. I'm using some Honeybee Precision Glue, and I brought that over to my ornament with the glue just on the little stem of each leaf. I layered that up and I put the lighter leaf on top, and then I adhered the ornament topper, the little hanging part that was cut out of that matte gold cardstock, which has texture on it because of my cutting plate in my die cutting sandwich. So I adhered that on, and then I put a little bit of glue in the center of that flower since my pearl had flown off. So I just double adhered it. And to finish off the leaves, I just adhered the berries. So I had one berry sort of tucked underneath the lighter colored green leaf on top. And then for the other one, I just put it just directly on top. I liked having those three up at the top to kind of cover up where it met the gold ornament topper. I then picked out some cardstock from Concord & Night. This is the sea glass color, and this is going to be what's behind the ornament. I thought it'd be really fun to use the Holly and Foliage 3D embossing folder from Spellbinders. So I misted and kind of dampened the cardstock on both sides, and then ran it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine, using the die cutting sandwich with the universal plate system. So I love this embossing folder. I think I've already used it once before in this year's holiday card series, but I just love how beautiful this is. It's nice and big, but has lots of texture. It's one of my favorites. I used my heat tool just to dry it completely since it was still a little bit damp. And then I also picked out some Midnight cardstock and I set that aside for the greeting, which we'll get back to in a minute. I used Juniper ink from Concord & Ninth, and I'm glad I kind of tested it off to the side because this was a very juicy ink pad, and I didn't want to bring in that much color, just enough to kind of darken the edges and fade off to the center of this sea glass cardstock with the texture. I then brought in my Midnight ink pad, and that really intensified the edge. I wanted to bring in a little bit of a navy blue that would match the greeting that I'm going to be stamping here in just a minute. So I added all that Midnight ink on the outer edge, and I just love how dramatic this looks. I think it's gonna look great with the ornament. So I picked out some red and white baker's twine to tie through the top of the ornament. And I'm first going to adhere it to the card. I'm not going to tie anything around it quite yet, but I realized that I needed to have the greeting on the card before I did that so that I could get spacing right. So I picked out a stamp from the stamp set and I stamped it in white pigment ink. Now I did use an anti-static powder tool to prep this navy cardstock, so it's going to give me a really good chance to not have embossing powder all over the place. So I stamped my greeting and then I used some gold embossing powder from Burgess Monroe. This is the color Gilded. It's my favorite gold embossing powder shade. And I'm going to tap that off and shake off the excess. And then I can use my heat tool to melt and smooth out all of that powder. I used a Tim Holtz mini trimmer just to trim this down a little bit. I love this mini trimmer for this exact occasion for cutting out little greetings. And then I used my microfiber towel or rag just to take off any of that extra anti-static powder. Used my scissors just to give it a nice ribbon end. And then I put some foam adhesive on the back of my greeting and adhered it to the bottom of my ornament. This is why I needed to have the greeting first so that I could figure out exactly how it was going to look on the card. I put some foam tape behind the ornament and then kind of centered it on this textured background, maybe a little bit lower than center. And then I took the strings that I already have attached and I pulled them taut up to the very top and wrapped it around onto the back. I plan to adhere this to my card using some foam tape, so I don't need to make the string look nice on the back. I just used some masking tape just to hold that string in place and then trimmed off the excess. I finished off the twine with a little bow that I've already tied, and I'm going to put a little tiny dot of glue right at the top of that ornament and then place my bow on top and hold it in place just for 30 seconds or so it stays in place. And then I cut the tails off so that they're not too long and covering up too much of my ornament. So I'm going to adhere this to my 5x7 card base. This was actually, I had planned to make a smaller card, so I was just going to keep it at that. But then I decided I wanted a little more white, and I thought that a very wide white border on a 5x7 card would look great. And this was pretty much the perfect dimensions for a 5x7 card. So I adhered that using some foam tape, And then I had this leftover gold frame that I had cut out using the A7 thin frames dies from Simus Stamp. I'd cut it out for a different card and then never used it. So I wanted my frame to be a little bit closer to the colorful cardstock on the center of my card. So instead of using the frame as it was cut, it was much larger, I cut down each of the sides to be a little bit shorter and then adhered them to my card. I really love how snug this border is to the main card design. And I just used a little bit of liquid glue to adhere that down to my card. And for each new side, I cut it before I adhered it, and that helped me get the sizing just about perfect. So this is the finished card for today. I love how this turned out. In my mind, I thought it would be a much lighter and brighter card, probably why I wanted that really thick white border in the end. But I love how dramatic that textured background turned out. I think it looks really great with this ornament that is mostly monochromatic color with those holly and berry leaves. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'll be back on Friday with day 15 of the holiday card series. Until then, thanks so much for watching.